Welcome back to Ethics. My name's Tom. I'm your instructor, and today we are talking about a famous Platonic dialogue called Euthyphro. This dialogue is famous not so much for the answers it gives, but for the question it raises. And that question is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? Right? There's an issue of dependency here. And when we're talking about holy, the way it's translated in this dialogue, it has more of the connotation of what is just or what is good or what is right. Okay. And so the idea here is, um, how do we understand our ethical principles to be grounded? Right? And this idea kind of flirts with or kind of tries to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in the idea of what's called divine command theory, the idea that ethical principles are basically rooted in what God says they are, right? The authority of God. So we will get to this question in just a minute. First, I want to kind of lead up to that and look at this dialogue. One thing to make note of is that the relationship between Plato and Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates himself did not write anything. Only Plato wrote, and Plato uses Socrates as kind of his main protagonist in all of his dialogues. So he uses Socrates as kind of like himself. So whenever you see Socrates talking, it's usually what Plato's thinking. So anyways, so this is the Euthyphro, and the main interlocutor was Socrates as Euthyphro. I'm not going to go through all the details of the dialogue, but it starts off with Euthyphro at a courthouse. He's prosecuting his dad for something somewhat controversial, and this sparks Socrates's interest, and he thinks, "Oh well, you seem pretty firm in your conviction. You must really know what justice is, what the right is, or what the good is, right?" And so one way to track Platonic dialogues is to, Socrates will raise an issue. What is justice? What is knowledge? What is love? These kinds of things. And then you'll get different definitions from his interlocutor, and then usually Socrates kind of like tries to tear them apart a little bit, and the definitions will shift and they'll change and they'll modify, and so you kind of track those modifications, and that's what I do in my notes here. So the first definition, when he asks him, well, you must know what justice is, Euthyphro says justice is prosecuting wrongdoers, right? Now this is rejected pretty quickly, even though there is a pretty intuitive sense in which this works, right? So justice is about bringing people to justice, and that's what we usually mean when we track down wrongdoers and bring them to court or whatnot. Of course, just to be a principle, the overarching principle, the definition of justice, it's not going to work out, because what about all the people who follow the law? Isn't that being just? What about people who do good things, right? Like, giving charity to someone who's down and out, right? That seems like it's the just thing to do, the right thing to do. And so this definition is just about the negative side of justice, really. So you need to kind of expand it. And so the way Euthyphro does is he says his second definition is that justice is what is agreeable to the gods, right? And here, of course, we're in an ancient Greek pantheon, so they have many gods. It's not the monotheistic tradition of Western culture that we're familiar with. And so, we're talking about different gods, and they all have different opinions. And really quickly, and also the gods are much more anthropomorphized, right? They're much more like people. They have faults and these kinds of things. But very quickly, we see that definition is not going to do either, because these gods can disagree on things, right? So what might be agreeable to one god might not be agreeable to another, and so this forms an inconsistency. So then the third definition is pretty quick fix here, that justice is whatever all the gods love, right? So whatever is agreeable to all the gods that they completely agree on, right? So you just kind of drop all the things that they disagree on. And so this, looks more like a monotheistic kind of picture, right? So it's like because we kind of get rid of all the differences between all the gods, and we talk about the thing that like all the gods respect. Um, and right here we get a thesis that is very similar to what is known as divine command theory in ethics. And this is the idea that what is right because God says so, right? It's all rooted in either God's nature or God's opinion. It kind of gets a little dicey here about how you understand God's authority exactly, right? But that's the idea, right? They're divine commands, right? Commands issued by God, right? So similar to something like the Ten Commandments, right? So this is the idea that Euthyphro lands on, right? What's just or what's holy is what God says so, right? And this is when the question gets raised. Well, um, is what is just because um, uh, because the gods think so, or does God kind of recognize what is already just or holy and kind of act accordingly, right? And this is an ambiguity that Euthyphro does not yet take care of here, right? So, what is this difference exactly? Well, it has to do with a dependency, right? So, it has to do with whether or not God is recognizing some kind of absolute moral principle, or whether those moral principles just rest on God's authority, right? Let me give a different example to kind of pull away from the ethics and God for a second. Think of a really popular band, right? Now, you might think about why they're popular in two different ways, right? One is to say that, the reason why they're popular is because lots of people like them, right? And you might actually think that this band is not very talented. They don't make very good music. It's just a lot of people like them, right? And so their popularity is completely dependent upon just a lot of people's opinions, okay? But you could also think that the reason why the band is very popular is because they are very, very talented, right? And they're making very good music. And that really the reason why they're popular is because lots of people recognize that talent and kind of form their opinions accordingly, right? And so it's them being good musicians that makes them popular, not just people uh, liking them, right? This is the same difference that we see in this question of Euthyphro, right? And it has to do with whether or not God is, or in not a divine command theory exactly, but whether the gods are kind of constrained by some more objective sense of ethical standards, ethical rights that are not dependent upon the gods' opinions, and instead the gods are kind of conforming to recognize this ultimate authority, or whether or not ethical standards, ethical principles are just dependent upon the opinions of the gods in this sense, or in divine command theory would be just because God says so, right? And so in the monotheistic tradition and medieval philosophy and stuff, this really has to do with whether or not God is constrained by ethical principles, or whether or not God is kind of creates ethical principles, right? And what's really at stake here is whether or not there is an absolute sense of good or right. That means it's not dependent upon anything, even the opinion of God, right? And so the distinction that I like to point out at the end of this dialogue and one that will definitely carry with us and kind of enrich as we go through the semester, is this distinction between moral relativism and moral objectivism, right? Moral relativism is that the idea that moral concepts and moral principles are, only true insofar as um, uh, uh, they are dependent upon the opinions or practices of a culture or a person, right? So they're true relative to some system of beliefs, whatever that is. So in moral relativism, the most popular kind of version of this is cultural relativism, right? There's no overarching sense of right or wrong according to moral relativism. There's just different cultures that do things differently, right? And so you can be wrong according to a culture, but there is no like objective standard, right? There's no way to evaluate different cultures, right? And then you could also be a subjective relativist, which means that everyone just basically has their own system of beliefs, their own personal system of beliefs, and then moral principles do not kind of go beyond that. I think subjective relativism is very difficult to hold on to, because we pass judgment on other people, right? And we tend to think not just that I don't like stealing, but that stealing is wrong, right? Not that I just don't like murder, it's just that murder is wrong, right? This is the way we tend to think about moral principles. So, on the other hand, moral objectivism, which would be kind of the thesis that if you think God is recognizing moral principles, is the idea that moral concepts kind of have an absolute meaning, right? They hold independently of any system or context, right? And so this would be the idea that like stealing is wrong no matter where you live, when you live, who you're hanging out with. It just doesn't matter, right? It's just wrong. It's in a universal sense, right? And the idea would be that our different systems of belief, whether from a subjective point of view or a cultural point of view, actually conform to that overarching objective sense of morality, right? And a lot of the people we will read hold some version of moral objectivism. And then some of the people we read later in the semester will kind of, what would you say, branch out into relativistic concerns, or at least poke holes in the idea of moral objectivism in different ways, right? So anyways, that's pretty much it for now. I'll be talking with you soon.